The theory of democratization, transitions to democracy from different kinds of authoritarian rule has developed a lot in the last 20 years or so. The oldest and most popular theory is the theory that as countries modernize, as society becomes more complex, as people grow richer, as people become more educated, there's a tendency for countries to become democratic, or to become more politically open. This theory has been challenged by various scholars who, for instance, see exceptions. Singapore is a very rich country, but it's not very democratic. And other people have pointed to the states of the Persian Gulf, which have very high incomes these days, but are also highly authoritarian. So now people come to believe that countries that are very rich in oil are less likely to democratize, even if they become rich. So Russia, in fact, and the Soviet Union, in fact, fits into this debate quite well, because clearly in the Brezhnev era, there had been very significant economic development, especially in the first part. The country had become more educated, higher education had spread, people had become much more urbanized, more and more people lived in the cities. So in a sense, it fits into that paradigm, into that view that as countries develop economically, they arrive at a point where pressures for more freedom of different kinds, more open government, become stronger and lead to some rupture. So we can see the Soviet Union under Gorbachev with perestroika as being a case in which the modernization theory seems to work. Of course, there were many details about how it happened, and I think here we see the role of individuals in history. If the leader chosen after Chernenko had been Grishin, for instance, one of the other members of the Politburo, it's very unlikely that he would have attempted the kind of reforms that Gorbachev attempted. So we can see perestroika in that light, as part of a process which grew out of the economic development, the increasing complexity of Soviet society, but we can also see it as a case in which the individual mattered a lot. I think then, if we look at the rest of the post-communist world, it's clear that what happened there, although again it was prepared by this process of economic modernization, nevertheless was triggered by what happened in the Soviet Union, by Gorbachev. And had there not been the signal that Gorbachev sent to the regimes and the populations of Eastern Europe, then we wouldn't have seen this succession of mostly relatively non-violent revolutions in 1989, leading to the changes there. So if we think about the 1990s, at first sight, it could seem in contradiction with modernization theory. We have a period in which the economy contracts quite significantly, incomes are going down, not up, and yet some kind of process, a quite chaotic process of political development continues and takes place. This raises the question, what exactly is it about modernizing societies that leads to the pressures for democracy? Well, the structure of society is still more or less the same. It's just this much greater frustration at a time of economic crisis. The findings of scholars who've studied the processes of democratization and political change in general is that major economic crises very often stimulate some change. Sometimes it may be towards more open, free societies, sometimes just the opposite. The big breakdowns of democracy in Europe in the 1930s came at a time of extreme economic crisis, the Great Depression. So economic crises don't necessarily work against the logic of modernization. In fact, they can trigger some of the consequences. They can make political some of the consequences of what has up till then perhaps been a long period of growth in which society has changed without affecting the political structures. So I think Russia in the 1990s, we see this chaotic improvisation, this lack of any strong institutions of the new kind, this attempt to change, but with very little in the way of guidelines. There was no blueprint. Nobody knew exactly which type of system could be built, how to build it. It wasn't a question of conscious design, it was a question of evolution of one order or another. So often people, when looking at the 90s, focus on particular political events, like the election of 1996, which some people feel was not an honest election, the storming of the parliament in October 1993. Obviously, these are extremely dramatic events, but when I look at the 1990s and try to think about what were the key processes, what were the key elements that determined what happened, I focus on two other things. One thing is simply the process of economic collapse and eventually recovery. And I don't think that the government of Igor Gaidar and the reform strategy he chose can be blamed for this. I think the condition of the country that Gaidar became responsible for was the cause of the serious problems, along with the lack of resources that the state had, the very limited and poorly timed contributions from the West. All this made it extremely difficult to turn the economy around, and as a result, the political opinion became more and more hostile towards the central authorities, towards Yeltsin and his regime through the 1990s. I think the economic processes were very important for how the politics developed, and as we saw, it was after the economy finally started to recover that a president was able to consolidate power and start making choices. Yeltsin, I think, really was not able to make many choices that stuck, many choices that mattered, because he simply didn't have the kind of popularity and the legitimacy that comes from popularity. So one thing was the economic process. The other huge, extremely important dynamic in the 1990s was between the center and the regions. And we saw in 1992, 1993, first even in 1990, what was called the Parade of Sovereignties, regions within Russia, first of all ethnic republics, but then even non-ethnic Russian regions, oblasts, krais, declaring autonomy, demanding greater political rights, taking control of locally based resources, taking over federal enterprises, refusing to remit taxes, to the point where in 1993, about a third of the regions were not remitting taxes to the central budget. And this was creating a fiscal crisis. And various politicians at different points in the early 90s, I think seriously believed, at least so they said, that there was a danger that the Russian state could disintegrate. So I think a huge challenge in the 1990s was how to stop this process of separatism, or even if it wasn't that most of these regions wanted to separate, this centrifugal force driving the country apart and reducing the fiscal resources for the center, which were what were crucial to keep the state intact. And my theory, which not everybody shares, but my theory about how the dynamic was changed was that the Yeltsin administration intuitively settled on a policy of appeasing the ethnic regions that were most determined to demand additional rights, that were most assertive, that were most threatening. And after they demobilized regions such as Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, the leading ethnic republics, it became much more risky for the other regions who had been following the lead of those most assertive regions to continue to do so. So I think that process was extremely important, and we saw the centrifugal stage up until about 1994, and then a gradual move to more centralization. Now, there was one exception to that, obviously, and that was Chechnya. And in Chechnya, the policy of fiscal accommodation, of reaching agreements, of basically appeasing regions in order to undercut this bandwagon of anti-center demands, that strategy never even began. Now, maybe it was impossible for one reason or another, or maybe you can blame one side more than the other. But in any case, it didn't happen. And decisions were then made to make this confrontation military. And I think that was perhaps the third crucial event of the 1990s, that military force was used within Russia for the first time, I think, since 1945. So some people might argue that the way in which national issues arose in the perestroika period under Gorbachev undermined his attempt to establish some kind of controlled, moderate transition to a more open order in which the Communist Party would nevertheless remain the dominant force. And in a similar way, some could argue that in the 1990s, Yeltsin's struggle to prevent disintegration in the Russian state undermined the process of democratization in Russia. I'm not sure about that. I would have to think more. In a sense, the conflict between the center and the regions did exacerbate the conflict between the president and the parliament before 1993. Both Hasbulatov and Yeltsin were appealing to regional elites. So the central conflicts were projected onto the regions, and the regions exploited that in part, and that added to both the problems in the center and the centrifugal strains. This central conflict gave leverage to the regional elites to pressure the center. But I'm not sure that I would agree that the solution that Yeltsin found to this, and I'm not saying that he had a conscious plan or conception of this, but instinctively he solved this through this process of reaching accommodation bilaterally with a whole series of the leading, the most separatist, let's say, republics, although none of them, other than Chechnya, overtly demanded independence. Nevertheless, Yeltsin managed to stabilize the situation through that strategy. I don't think that in itself was undemocratic, and I don't think that harmed democracy. It was more in the late 1990s when the center was trying to reestablish control, to take back some of the concessions it had made to the regions earlier on, in part because it was absolutely necessary to re-centralize some fiscal resources and to reestablish the authority of the Constitution over local laws, regional laws. But I think the attempt to reconsolidate power in the center and Yeltsin's preference for somebody from the security services who he thought would have greater ability to do that, I think that was harmful for democracy, but was not a necessary consequence of the earlier success or the strategy that Yeltsin had chosen. Some people say that after the difficulties of democracy in the 1990s, some would say the failures of democracy in the 1990s, the reconsolidation, the re-centralization of power that occurred in the 2000s was inevitable. That in the 1990s, Russians really learned to hate democracy or lost any illusions about it, and therefore, as a result, were yearning for some kind of return to strong authoritarian rule. I don't believe that's the case, although it is true that democracy goes in waves, both worldwide. We see big waves, periods in which many countries democratize, and then periods in which very few do, or even some revert. We also see those waves within countries. There are periods of dramatic breakthroughs, then often reversions, so 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But what I see is not a reversion that eliminates what came before. It's definitely a movement in the other direction, in what I would say is the wrong direction. But it doesn't mean that we're going back to the initial starting point. So why did this happen in the 2000s? Was it inevitable because of the 1990s? I think a huge amount depended on the identity of the leader who was in charge at the time when economic growth shot up to 5%, 10% a year and stayed that way for 8 years. I think if we could pick a leader of practically any political persuasion from any part of the political spectrum, put him in power under those economic conditions, and the country would have moved in whatever direction he wanted it to. That was the nature of things. It was not so much that the political problems of the 1990s made Putinism, as we see it now, inevitable. It was that the extreme economic volatility, this swing from very severe crisis into an extended period of rapid growth, meant that there would be very little restraint on whoever was in the presidential spot after 2000.